Take a slow, deep breath and let the world outside fade away. Imagine an ocean, not of water, but of grass. A landscape so vast, so silent, that you can hear the whisper of the wind as it travels for 1,000 miles, uninterrupted. This is the Great Steppe, the ancient beating heart of Eurasia. Throughout history, empires have risen and fallen, leaving behind monuments of stone and cities of dust. Their stories are etched into ruins we can see and touch. But what of an empire that left no cities? An empire whose borders were the ever-shifting horizon, whose palaces were magnificent wagons covered in felt, and whose throne was the saddle of a horse. They were ghosts on the grassland, masters of the horse and the bow. They buried their kings under man-made mountains of earth with treasures of breathtaking gold. Yet they wrote down no history of their own, leaving their story to be told only by their enemies and by the silent artifacts they left behind. They were a phantom empire, both everywhere and nowhere at once. So, who were these invisible lords of the steppe? Tonight, we travel back across the centuries, not to walk through the ruins of a city, but to ride with the wind across the endless plains, to listen for the echo of thundering hooves, and to uncover the lost story of the Scythians. Welcome to Forbidden Lore.
To understand the Scythians, you must first understand their home. Not a country defined by lines on a map, but a world defined by the sky above and the earth below. We call it the steppe, a single, monolithic belt of grassland that stretches for 5,000 miles from the edge of Hungary in the west, all the way to the shores of the Pacific in the east. It is a place that challenges our very idea of what a homeland can be. Picture again that ocean of grass. In the spring, it is a fleeting miracle, a sea of emerald green and vibrant wildflowers that erupts in a riot of color. For a few short weeks, the land is generous and soft. But this vibrant youth is ephemeral. Summer comes quickly, a wave of dry heat that bleaches the landscape to a pale gold, baking the earth until it cracks. The sun is a relentless force, and the only shade is the shadow you cast yourself. Autumn brings a chill to the wind, a mournful sigh that rustles through the dry stalks, painting the world in shades of bronze and amber. And then comes winter. Winter on the steppe is not merely cold. It is a primordial power. It is an unforgiving season of howling blizzards, known as the Buran, where the snow falls so thick it erases the horizon, blending heaven and earth into a single, swirling vortex of white dot. This is not a land that nurtures cities. The soft earth and the absence of stone make poor foundations for monuments. The extreme seasons make settled agriculture a gamble with starvation. An army that marches into this immensity finds no walls to besiege, no capital to conquer, no farms to burn for supplies. The steppe itself is the ultimate defense. It swallows armies whole, leaving them lost and starving, chasing an enemy that melts away like a mirage. It is a crucible, a landscape that does not just shape people, it forges them. It demands a different way of life, a different way of thinking, a different way of being. For millennia, this world waited for a people who could solve its riddle. It waited for a people who understood that to command this land, you could not conquer it. You had to yield to it. You had to move with its rhythms, embrace its harshness, and learn its secrets. The solution to the riddle of the steppe was not found in stone, but in flesh and blood. It was found in the horse. On the steppe, the horse was more than an animal. It was a partner in a symbiotic dance of survival. These were not the tall, elegant creatures of royal stables, but a hardier breed. Stocky, resilient, with incredible endurance, able to survive on sparse grass and endure the brutal winters. For the people of the steppe, the horse provided everything. It gave them speed, allowing them to hunt, to trade, and to wage war across vast distances. Its milk, fermented into a potent drink called kumis, provided nourishment. Its hide provided leather, its sinews provided thread. The horse was the engine of their entire civilization. And so, out of this world of grass and wind, a new kind of human emerged. They were the horse lords. And the greatest among them, the ones who would perfect this way of life and burn their name into the memory of the ancient world, were the Scythians. They appear on the edge of history not as a crawling infant civilization, but as a fully formed force of nature. To the settled peoples of the south, in Greece, in Persia, in Assyria, the first sight of them must have been terrifying. It would begin as a tremor on the horizon, a low rumble that grew into the sound of 1,000 thundering hooves. Then a cloud of dust would rise, and out of it would emerge figures unlike any they had ever seen. Riders who seemed not to be on their horses, but a part of them, moving with a fluid grace that made man and beast into a single, deadly entity. They wore trousers and tunics, a practical uniform for a life in the saddle, a stark contrast to the robes and skirts of the southern empires. Their hair was long, their beards thick, and their skin was etched with intricate, dark blue tattoos of swirling beasts and mystical symbols. They were a vision of wild, untamable freedom. They did not fight in organized blocks of infantry. They were a swirling swarm, a hornet's nest of mounted archers who could rain death from a distance and vanish before any response could be mustered. This was their kingdom. Not a patch of earth, but a kingdom of motion. Their cities were their herds of cattle, sheep, and horses. Their palaces were their ornate, felt-covered wagons. Vast mobile homes that creaked and groaned as they were pulled across the plains by teams of oxen. Their wealth was not measured in land, but in livestock and in gold. And their law was the simple, brutal law of survival on the open steppe. They did not conquer the land. They became the land. They were the human expression of the steppe's wild spirit, resilient, relentless, and eternally in motion. They were the living answer to the earth's ancient riddle. But this only deepens the mystery. Now that we have seen their world, we must ask the question that has puzzled historians for centuries. From what corner of this vast, grassy ocean did these incredible people first emerge? Where did the story of the Scythians truly begin? The world of the Scythians was the endless steppe, a kingdom defined not by landmarks but by the vast open sky. We have ridden through their landscape in our minds and felt the wind that was their constant companion. But a land, no matter how immense, is only half of a story. The other half belongs to the people. And for the Scythians, the question of their origins is a mystery as deep and as wide as the plains they called home. They left us no books, no stone tablets declaring their lineage. They moved through the world like the wind itself, leaving few permanent traces to find their beginnings. We must become detectives of the ancient world. We must listen to the stories told about them by others. We must sift through the legends they told about themselves. And we must learn to read the silent testimony of the earth they were buried in. Our search for their origins is not a single path, but a journey through 3 different kinds of stories: the story of myth, the story of migration, and the story of the silent earth. Let us begin with myth, with a tale the Scythians themselves whispered around their campfires on cold, clear nights. It is a story preserved for us by the Greek historian Herodotus, a story of gods, gold, and destiny. According to this legend, The land that would one day be known as Scythia was at first a pristine and empty wilderness. The first man to ever live there was named Targitaus. He was no mere mortal. His father was said to be Papaios, the Scythian equivalent of Zeus, the great god of the sky. His mother was a daughter of the river Berestians, a nymph of the flowing water. Targitaus was a child of the sky and the earth, the perfect ancestor for a people who would live their entire lives between the two. He had 3 sons. The eldest was Lepaxe, the middle son was Arpaxe, and the youngest of all was Coluxe. For a time, they lived under their father in this empty land. Then one day, a miracle occurred. From the heavens above, 4 objects, all made of pure, gleaming gold, fell to the earth. There was a plough and a yoke, symbols of cultivation. There was a battle axe, a symbol of war. And there was a sacred cup, a symbol of ritual and kingship. The eldest brother, Lepaxe, saw the golden treasures. First, as he approached, hoping to claim them, the gold began to burn with a magical fire, and he was forced to retreat. The second brother, Arpaxe, then made his attempt, but he too was driven back by the searing, otherworldly flames. Finally, it was the turn of the youngest son, Coluxe. As he drew near, the fire immediately extinguished itself, allowing him to gather the sacred objects into his arms. Seeing this divine sign, the 2 older brothers understood its meaning. They yielded their power and their birthright, and it was agreed that Coluxe, the youngest, would be the king of all the Scythian people. From these 3 brothers, the legend says, all the different tribes of the Scythians were born. But it was from Coluxe, the one chosen by the divine gold, that the lineage of the royal Scythians, the mightiest of all the tribes, would descend. This story tells us so much about how they saw themselves, not as a wandering people, but as a nation born directly from their land, with a divine right to rule it, bestowed upon them by the gods themselves in the form of gold. The plough, the axe, and the cup were the talismans of their entire civilization. But there is another story, also told by Herodotus. This one is not a divine myth, but a chronicle of men, of migration, and of conflict. This was the version favored by the Greeks who lived as neighbors to the Scythians along the shores of the Black Sea. It paints a very different picture. In this telling, the Scythians were not born of the land they inhabited in Herodotus's time. Instead, their story begins far to the east. In the heart of Asia, they were a nomadic tribe, one among many, living a life of constant movement and struggle. To their east lived another powerful and warlike people, known as the Macedite. Under pressure from this rival tribe, the Scythians were forced into a desperate choice: to stand and be annihilated, or to abandon their ancestral lands and seek a new home in the west. They chose survival. What followed was a great migration, an exodus that would have taken years, perhaps even generations. It was a slow, inexorable river of people and livestock flowing westward across the immense grasslands. They crossed the semi-mythical Araxes River and finally spilled into the lands north of the Black Sea. But this land was not empty. It was the territory of another people, the Cimmerians. The Cimmerians, upon hearing of the approaching Scythian horde, were thrown into chaos. There, kings wished to stand and fight for their homeland, but the common people were struck with fear and wished only to flee. The tribe was split by this disagreement, and in a tragic act of self-destruction, they divided themselves into 2 equal groups and fought until every last man was slain. The survivors, leaderless and broken, abandoned their country, fleeing south along the seacoast into Anatolia. The Scythians, finding the land empty, claimed it as their own. But their conflict with the Sumerians was not over. In their pursuit of the fleeing remnant, they took a wrong turn, hugging the Caucasus Mountains, and inadvertently poured down into the lands of the Near East, bringing a new wave of terror, an instability to the ancient empires of Media and Assyria. These two stories, one of divine origin and one of violent migration, paint a conflicting portrait. Were the Scythians the chosen children of this land, or were they aggressive newcomers who seized it by force? The myths give them a sense of ancient legitimacy, but history often belongs to the victors, and a story of conquest is perhaps a more realistic, if less romantic, tale. The truth, as is often the case, may be a complex echo of both, but the stories of men and gods can only take us so far. To find a deeper truth, we must turn away from the words of the Greeks and listen, instead, to the silent whispers of the earth itself. The stories of the ancients, passed down through the writings of Herodotus, give us two compelling but contradictory narratives of the Scythian origin, one of divine right and one of violent conquest. To find a deeper truth, we must turn from the words of men and gods and learn to read the silent testimony of the earth itself. Our greatest library is not made of papyrus, but of soil and stone and bone. It is found within the great burial mounds, the kurgans, that still stand like sleeping giants on the steppe. For 2 centuries, archaeologists have been the careful translators of these silent witnesses, and in a remote and unexpected corner of the world, they uncovered a revelation that would rewrite the beginning of the Scythian story. Our search takes us far from the Black Sea, eastward for thousands of miles, to the Tuva Republic in southern Siberia. This is a land of mountains and high valleys, nestled at the very heart of Asia. It was here, in a place known as the Valley of the Kings, that Russian archaeologists began to excavate a kurgan called Arzenwan. What they found was staggering. This was no simple burial mound. It was a colossal, intricate structure, built like a great wheel, with a central hub and dozens of wooden spokes radiating outwards to form separate chambers. At its center lay the tomb of a king and his queen, surrounded by the graves of his highest-ranking retainers, but it was the sacrifice that accompanied them that stunned the world. Arranged in neat, orderly rows, as if ready for a final spectral parade, were the skeletons of more than 160 horses, fully equipped, with ornate saddles, bridles, and bits. It was a ghostly cavalry, destined to ride with their master into the afterlife. The sheer scale and organization were breathtaking, but it was the age of Arzenwan that sent shockwaves through the world of history. Carbon dating revealed it was constructed in the 9th or 8th century before Christ. This was centuries older than the celebrated Scythian tombs of the Black Sea region. The story the earth was telling was that the origins of Scythian royal culture, with its elaborate burials and horse sacrifices, might not have been in the west, but far, far to the east. Decades later, near that very same spot, a second discovery would confirm this theory beyond all doubt. Another kurgan, Arzen II, was identified, and this time, the archaeologists found what they had always dreamed of, a royal tomb that had never been touched by looters. It was a perfect time capsule. When they entered the central chamber, they were met with a sight of almost unimaginable splendor. The bodies of the Scythian king and queen lay adorned in gold from head to toe. Their clothing had been covered with thousands of tiny, golden panther figures. The queen wore a magnificent golden headdress, and the king a massive, solid gold pectoral, or chest piece, a masterpiece of ancient art. In total, the tomb contained over 20 kilograms, nearly 50 pounds, of masterfully crafted gold objects. Intricate figures of boars, deer, and panthers, all rendered in the distinctive, swirling animal style that would become the hallmark of Scythian art across the entire steppe. Arzen too proved that the high valleys of Siberia were not some remote Scythian outpost. They were a vibrant, wealthy, and powerful heartland. This was a cradle of their civilization, a place where their culture was forged and perfected before it ever began its famous westward expansion. The silent earth had spoken, and it pointed decisively to an origin deep within the Asian continent. Yet, in our modern age, there is one final story to be told, a story written not in gold or in myth, but in the very fabric of life itself, the story of genetics. By analyzing the faint traces of DNA preserved in ancient Scythian bones, from Hungary to Siberia, scientists have begun to map their deepest ancestry, and what they have found connects all the other stories together. The genetic thread leads back in time, long before the Scythians, to an earlier Bronze Age people known as the Yamnaya culture. These were the original horse lords of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a vast and powerful group believed to be the common ancestors of many of the peoples of Europe and Asia. The Scythians, it turns out, were their direct descendants. They were not newcomers to the steppe. They were, in a way, its native children, the inheritors of a way of life that was thousands of years old. And so, the mystery of their origin begins to clear. The genetic evidence provides the deep root, showing us a people whose ancestors had always been of the steppe. The archaeological wonders of Arzen show us where their specific, powerful culture as Scythians first bloomed into a golden age. And the ancient stories of Herodotus, of a great migration from east to west, now seem not like myths, but like the faint, true echo of that very expansion. As this vibrant culture spread from its Siberian heartland to dominate the vast ocean of grass. The story of their beginning is not one simple answer, but a beautiful, complex tapestry woven from myth, from migration, from buried gold, and from an ancient genetic thread. They were a people born of the deepest roots of the steppe, forged into a golden culture in the heart of Asia, who then rode west to become the masters of the known world. Now that we have peered into the mists of their birth, let us turn to the world they perfected. How did they truly live, day by day? How did they fight with such devastating effect? What was it like to be a child of the endless steppe, born in a saddle, with the wind as your only guide? We have followed the Scythians out of the fog of prehistory, tracing their story through myth, migration, and the silent testimony of their golden graves. We have found their cradle in the high valleys of Asia and followed their thunderous ride to the shores of the Black Sea. But to truly know them, we must look beyond the grand sweep of their history. We must try to understand what it was like to live a single day, a single season, a single life in their world. We must learn what it meant to be a child of the endless steppe. The answer begins, as all things do in the Scythian world, with the horse taught to the Scythians. A horse was not a tool, a possession, or a simple beast of burden. It was a second self, a spirit partner that carried them through life. It is said that Scythian children learned to ride before they could properly walk. A toddler would be placed on the back of a steady old mare, their small hands gripping its mane, learning the rhythm and sway of the horse's gait as a fundamental lesson of existence, like breathing or drinking their mother's milk. The world, from their earliest memories, was not seen from the ground up, but from the height of a saddle. The horizon was their constant companion. This bond only deepened with time. A Scythian warrior and his chosen steed were a single entity. They spent so much time together that the Greeks, in their awe and terror, described them as a new kind of creature, a centaur of flesh and blood. The Scythian rider moved with an effortless grace, guiding his mount not with brute force, but with subtle shifts in weight and pressure from the knees, leaving both hands free to wield the deadly composite bow. This was not the rigid, formal horsemanship of a royal parade. This was an intuitive, living connection, a language without words spoken between man and beast. The horse was their legs, granting them a swiftness that seemed supernatural to the foot-bound armies of the south. It was their sustenance. The milk of the mares, fermented into the potent, effervescent drink known as kumis, was a staple of their diet, and in the end, the horse was their companion into the afterlife. The most profound expression of this bond is found in their graves. When a great warrior died, his favorite horses were sacrificed and buried with him, adorned in the finest tack, ready to ride alongside their master in the spirit world. To a Scythian, a life without a horse was unimaginable, and so too was an eternity without one. But while the individual warrior lived his life on horseback, the Scythian nation, the family, the entire society lived its life on wheels. If the horse was the first pillar of their civilization, the second was the wagon. These were not simple carts. The Greek writers described them with wonder, calling them houses on wheels. They were vast, sturdy platforms, some with 4 wheels, others with 6, pulled by teams of powerful oxen. Upon these platforms, a dwelling was constructed, often with a rounded roof, made from a lattice of wood and covered in thick, waterproof layers of felt. This felt, made from the wool of their sheep, was their shield against the elements. It kept out the biting winter wind, the driving rain, and the relentless summer sun. Inside these mobile homes was the domestic heart of the Scythian world. This is where families ate and slept. This is where women gave birth, and where the old and the sick were cared for. The wagons carried all their worldly possessions, ornate carpets, wooden chests, bronze cauldrons for cooking, and clay pots for storing food. They were the anchor in a world of constant motion, the one private, permanent space in a life lived under the open sky. Picture, for a moment, a Scythian tribe on the move. It would not be a rush, but a slow, deliberate procession. In the vanguard, and on the flanks, the warriors would ride, ever watchful, their bows ready. At the center would be the great river of wagons, creaking and groaning as they rolled over the uneven turf, a temporary city inching its way across the landscape, and flowing all around them, like water around islands, would be the immense herds of sheep, cattle, and spare horses, the source of all their wealth, grazing as they went. The air would be filled with the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the shouts of the herdsmen, and the rumble of 1,000 wooden wheels. This was the Scythian nation, not a place on a map, but a living, breathing, moving entity. This was home. To live in a house on wheels, with a horse as your constant companion, is to embrace a life of perpetual movement. But this was not a life of random, aimless wandering. The Scythian migration was a deliberate and ancient cycle, a slow dance with the seasons dictated by the fundamental needs of their herds. Their entire existence was a carefully planned journey, repeated year after year, generation after generation, until the rhythm of the land was encoded into their very being. The year would begin in the harsh crucible of winter. The tribe would seek shelter in the more temperate valleys of the south, often near the great rivers that carved through the plains. Here, the winds were less severe, and patches of grass could be found for the herds by clearing away the snow. It was a time of hunkering down, of survival. The wagons would be drawn together to form a windbreak, a temporary, fortified camp. Food was rationed. Stories were told around the warmth of a fire fueled by dried animal dung, and the tribe would wait for the land to be reborn. The signal for the great migration to begin was the coming of spring. It would start as a subtle shift in the wind, then a gradual melting of the snow. Finally, a wave of impossible green would sweep across the plains, a green fire that consumed the dead pale grass of winter. This was the signal. As the earth softened and the new grass grew, the herds would begin to stir, and the people with them. The great wagons would be readied, the oxen yoked, and the slow journey northward would commence, following the path of the spring rains and the most lush pastures. This was a time of plenty, of new life, as lambs, calves, and foals were born along the way. Summer and autumn were spent in these rich northern pastures. The herds would grow fat, and so would the people. It was a time for hunting the wild game, of the steppe, for trading with neighboring tribes, and for crafting the tools, weapons, and magnificent gold art for which they were famous. It was also a time for war, with the tribe at its strongest and the horses well-fed. Summer was the season for the raids and campaigns that made the Scythian name a thing of terror in the south. The diet that fueled this arduous life was simple and efficient, drawn almost entirely from the herds that accompanied them. Meat was the foundation of every meal, primarily mutton and beef, but horse meat was also eaten, especially on ceremonial occasions. They had perfected the art of cooking on the open plains, a skill born of necessity. Herodotus describes in detail a clever technique for when firewood was scarce. The Scythians would slaughter an animal, strip the flesh from the bones, and then stuff the meat back into the animal's stomach or paunch, adding some water. They would then light the bones, which burned surprisingly well, and set this makeshift stomach pot over the fire to boil the meat within. It was a self-contained meal, using every part of the animal with no need for a heavy bronze cauldron. Their other great source of sustenance was milk, which they consumed in many forms, from cheeses to yogurt. But most important of all was kumis, the fermented mare's milk that was their national drink. Fresh mare's milk would be poured into large leather churns and agitated until it began to ferment, transforming into a slightly thick, sour, and mildly alcoholic beverage. It was a drink that was both nourishing and intoxicating, a source of vital nutrients and a centerpiece of Scythian hospitality. To share kumis with a guest was a sign of welcome and respect, a ritual that bound their society. Together, this life, free from walls and fields, created a unique society with a unique understanding of the world. Wealth was not measured in acres of land, which had no meaning to them, but in the size of one's herd and the weight of one's gold. Law was not a set of written codes enforced by judges in a courtroom. It was a powerful set of traditions, centered on honor, loyalty to one's tribe, and the absolute authority of the chieftains. Justice was swift and often brutal. Oaths were considered sacred, sealed by a ceremony where the participants would draw their own blood, letting it drip into a cup of wine before dipping their weapons in the mixture and drinking from it together, binding themselves in a pact of blood. Their ultimate freedom was the freedom of the horizon. If a rival tribe grew too strong, if a foreign king sent an army, If the climate shifted and the rains failed, the Scythian solution was simple. They would move. Their entire nation could pack up and vanish into the immensity of the steppe, leaving their enemies to chase a phantom. This mobility was their greatest strength, their most profound political statement. They were a people who could not be conquered because they could not be contained. This life of constant movement, of hardship and fierce independence, created a people of incredible resilience and deep connection to their world. But it also created warriors of unparalleled skill. For on the steppe, where survival depended on one's ability to protect the herd from predators, both animal and human, the line between herder and soldier was as thin as the wind itself. A life lived in the saddle, in a world without walls, under the constant watch of a vast and often unforgiving sky, does more than shape a culture. It forges a warrior. For the Scythians, there was no distinction between a civilian and a soldier. Every man who could ride a horse and draw a bow was a defender of the tribe, a protector of the herd, and a potential raider. The skills needed for survival were the same skills needed for war. A boy who learned to hunt fleet-footed antelope from horseback was also learning how to pursue a fleeing enemy. A man who guarded his family's herds from wolf packs at night was also learning the vigilance of a sentry. The tribe did not have an army. The tribe was the army. This warrior ethos was woven into the very fabric of their identity. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us of a brutal coming-of-age ritual. A Scythian man was not permitted to drink from the communal wine cup at a festival until he had killed his first enemy in battle. Their society was a meritocracy of martial prowess, where status and honor were won not through inherited titles, but through acts of courage and skill in combat. They were conditioned from birth to be tough, resilient, and utterly ruthless. But this fierce spirit alone would not have made them the terror of the ancient world. Their dominance came from the perfection of a deadly trinity of warfare: the horse, the tactic, and the bow. We have already spoken of their intimate bond with the horse, the source of their unmatched mobility. But it was the bow that was the true heart of Scythian power. The Scythian bow was not a simple piece of wood. It was a masterpiece of composite engineering, a complex and elegant engine of death that was years in the making. In an age of heavy infantry and ponderous formations, this weapon was a revolutionary leap in military technology. Its construction was a slow and patient art. It began with a core of carefully selected wood, often maple or birch, which provided the basic frame. But the bow's incredible power came from the materials that were laminated onto this core. On the back of the bow, the side facing away from the archer, layers of animal sinew were applied. These tendons, taken from the legs and backs of deer or cattle, were painstakingly prepared and glued in place. Sinew is remarkable for its elasticity. When the bow was drawn, this layer would stretch and store immense tensile energy, like a tightly wound spring. On the belly of the bow, the side facing the archer, strips of horn were attached, typically from an ibex or a water buffalo. Horn is a material that resists compression with incredible force. As the bow was drawn, the horn belly would be squeezed, storing a different kind of powerful potential energy. These two opposing forces, the stretching of the sinew on the back and the compression of the horn on the belly, worked in perfect harmony. They were all held together by a powerful glue derived from the swim bladders of fish, a substance that took months, even a full year, to properly cure and set. The shape of the bow was as unique as its construction. When unstrung, it had a pronounced, recurved shape, curving back on itself in a C form. This reflex design meant that even before it was drawn, the limbs were already under significant tension. It took great strength just to string a Scythian bow, and even greater strength to draw it to its full potential. But the result of this ingenious design was a relatively small and compact weapon that could unleash an arrow with terrifying velocity and force, a force far superior to the simple wooden longbows used by many other cultures. The bow, however, is only one half of the weapon system. The other half, the arrow, was just as ingeniously designed for maximum lethality. The Scythians developed a revolutionary type of arrowhead, cast from bronze. Unlike flat arrowheads, theirs was typically trilobate, meaning it had 3 sharp blades protruding from a central point. This design was devastating. Upon impact, it created not a simple slit, but a triangular wound channel that caused massive internal bleeding, and was incredibly difficult to extract without causing even more damage. Archaeologists have found thousands of these deadly points, a testament to the sheer volume of arrows the Scythians could unleash. They were true masters of ranged warfare, a storm of death that could strike from a distance long before an enemy could bring their own spears or swords to bear. This weapon, this perfect marriage of natural materials and sophisticated design, held in the hands of a master horseman, was the key to their empire of the wind and grass. To possess a weapon as revolutionary as the Scythian composite bow is one thing. To build an entire system of warfare around it is another. The Scythians did not simply integrate the bow into existing military doctrine. They created a new doctrine, a fluid and terrifying form of combat that left the great infantry-based empires of the ancient world confused, frustrated, and utterly decimated. On the battlefield, a Scythian army did not look like an army at all. It was a swarm, a chaotic and swirling mass of riders that seemed to move without a formal command structure. There were no neat lines, no disciplined phalanxes, no ponderous forward march. Theirs was a controlled chaos, a whirlwind of individual warriors moving in concert, guided by signals from horns or standards. Their primary tactic was the embodiment of their nomadic spirit, constant motion. They would often begin an engagement by flowing around the flanks of an enemy army, keeping a safe distance while peppering the enemy ranks with a relentless barrage of arrows. They were masters of the feigned retreat, a maneuver that played on the arrogance and discipline of traditional armies. A contingent of Scythian riders would charge forward, unleash a volley of arrows, and then immediately turn and flee as if in a panic. An overconfident enemy commander, seeing a chance to crush these seemingly cowardly horsemen, would order his infantry to give chase. This was the fatal error. The disciplined lines of infantry would inevitably break apart as they ran, becoming a disorganized mob. The Scythians, on their faster horses, would easily stay ahead, leading their pursuers deeper into the open plain, exhausting them. Then, at a prearranged signal, the fleeing Scythians would turn as one in their saddles, a move that seemed impossible to the Greeks, and fire a final, devastating volley backwards into the now exposed and breathless ranks of their enemies. This was their signature move, a lethal parting gift. Against a stubborn formation that would not break, they employed the circle of death. Waves of riders would gallop in a continuous, rotating circle around the beleaguered infantry, each warrior firing an arrow as they passed the point of closest contact. It was a moving fortress of archery, an inexorable, grinding assault that offered no respite and no clear target to attack. For the soldiers trapped inside this maelstrom of arrows, it was a terrifying and demoralizing experience. being slowly bled dry by an enemy they could never reach. But the Scythians were not merely archers. They understood that every battle eventually comes to the brutal reality of close combat. When the enemy was sufficiently weakened and disorganized by their arrow storm, the Scythians would close in for the kill, and for this they carried a fearsome arsenal of close-quarters weaponry. Their most iconic sidearm was the akanax, a type of short sword or long dagger. It was a double-edged blade, designed for both cutting and thrusting in the chaotic scrum of a melee. Its hilt was distinctive, often lacking a traditional crossguard in favor of a heart-shaped or kidney-shaped guard. For a Scythian warrior, his akanax was a deeply personal item, a symbol of his status, and his hilt and scabbard were often lavishly decorated with the gold that they so adored alongside the akanax. Many warriors carried the sagaris, a long-handled battle-axe. This was a brutal weapon capable of delivering immense crushing force. Many designs featured a sharp, pointed fluke on the reverse side of the blade, an armor-piercing tool designed to puncture the bronze helmets and breastplates of their southern foes. Supplementing these were spears and javelins used for thrusting, and throwing in the initial charge to protect themselves. Scythian nobles and elite warriors wore a distinctive form of scale armor. This was not a solid plate cuirass, but a more flexible garment made of hundreds of individual bronze or iron scales, sewn in overlapping rows onto a thick leather or felt tunic. This provided excellent protection against arrows and slashing blows, while still allowing the rider the freedom of movement he needed on horseback. Their defense was completed by heavy bronze helmets, many of which showed the clear influence of Greek design, a testament to the lively trade, both in goods and in military ideas, that took place on the shores of the Black Sea. All of this deadly equipment was carried with an efficiency born of a life on the move. The Scythian archer did not carry a separate quiver and bow case. Instead, they developed a unique piece of equipment called the goritos. This was a combination case, a single container that housed both the precious composite bow and a full supply of arrows. It was worn slung from the belt at the warrior's left hip, perfectly positioned for a rapid draw. The goritos, like the akanax, was often a work of art in itself, a canvas of embossed leather and sheet gold depicting scenes of combat and mythology. This formidable warrior, a blur of motion, armored in scale and bronze, armed with a peerless bow and a deadly short sword, was the quintessential image of the Scythian. But this picture of a world of hypermasculine, bearded warriors is incomplete. For among the graves of these fierce men, archaeologists have found companions in death and in battle who have challenged our assumptions and given startling life to one of history's most enduring and powerful legends. The image of the Scythian warrior, a master of the horse and bow, is a powerful one. It is the image that struck fear into the hearts of Persian kings and Greek hoplites. But a warrior is never an island. An army, no matter how skilled, is always the product of the society that supports it. To truly understand the Scythian military machine, we must look beneath the surface of battle. We must explore the intricate social fabric that clothed their world, the invisible bonds of kinship, power, and ritual that held their nomadic empire together. What kind of society was it that could unleash such a force upon the world? The Scythian world was not a society of equals. It was a fiercely hierarchical structure, a pyramid of power with a mighty king at its apex. Their own origin myth of the three brothers and the divine golden gifts provides a blueprint for this structure. At the top were the descendants of Caluxi, the youngest brother chosen by the gods. These were the royal Scythians, a tribe so powerful and numerous that Herodotus claims they regarded all other Scythians as their slaves. This was a warrior aristocracy, a ruling class whose authority was absolute and whose status was seen as divinely ordained. At the pinnacle of this pyramid sat the king. The Scythian king was more than a mere political or military leader. He was a sacred figure, a high priest who served as the living link between the tribe, the earth, and the gods of their pantheon. His health was directly tied to the prosperity of the entire nation. If the king was well, the herds would be fat, the rains would come, and the tribe would be victorious in battle. If the king fell ill, it was taken as a sign that the sacred balance of the world was disturbed, and that someone had sworn a false oath by the royal hearth, the most potent and binding oath a Scythian could make. This belief gave the king immense power over his people. Soothsayers would be called to identify the perjurer who, once accused, was almost always found guilty and swiftly executed. The life of the king was the life of the people, and any threat to it was a threat to the cosmos itself. This sacred authority was reflected in the immense wealth and ceremony that surrounded the royal court. The gold that archaeologists have unearthed from the royal kurgans is not simply decoration. It is the physical manifestation of this divine power. Solid gold torques, magnificent chess pieces, weapons sheathed in gold leaf, even everyday items, like cups and bowls, were crafted from this precious metal, setting the king apart from all mortal men. Beneath the king and the royal clan was a broad and powerful class of warrior nobles. These were the chieftains of the lesser tribes, the commanders of the army, and the king's personal retinue, his sworn companions in life and in death. They were the living embodiment of the Scythian martial ideal. Their lives were dedicated to the arts of war and the hunt. They were bound to their king by the solemn blood oaths we have spoken of, a bond of loyalty so strong that it was expected to transcend even death itself. When a king died, his closest companions, his cupbearer, his cook, his groom, and his messenger, were all ritually sacrificed and buried with him, destined to serve him in the next world as they had in this one. These nobles controlled vast herds of their own and commanded the fierce loyalty of their own clans. Their wealth displayed in their fine armor, their decorated horses, and the gold adornments on their clothing was a constant and visible reminder of their status and their success in battle. They were the sinews of the Scythian Empire, the enforcers of the king's will, and the leaders on the field of combat. Below this elite class of royals and nobles were the common people, the vast majority of the Scythian nation. These were the nomadic herders who formed the economic backbone of the empire. They were the ones who tended the great herds of sheep, cattle, and horses, who drove the wagons, and who made up the bulk of the army in times of war. While their lives were not filled with the golden splendor of the nobility, they were not a downtrodden peasantry. They were free men and women, proud members of their clans, fiercely independent and skilled in the arts of survival. Their loyalty to their chieftains was the foundation upon which the entire pyramid of power was built. Herodotus also speaks of another distinct group, the agricultural Scythians, living further to the west, closer to the great rivers. These tribes had adopted a more settled lifestyle. They cultivated grain, not just for their own use, but for sale to the Greek colonies that dotted the coast of the Black Sea. This trade in grain was a source of enormous wealth, and it was the royal Scythians who controlled this lucrative commerce. taxing the agricultural tribes and acting as the powerful middlemen in this exchange between the world of the steppe and the world of the Mediterranean. This entire structure, from the common herder to the sacred king, was designed to function in a world of constant motion and conflict. But in this picture of a society dominated by bearded warriors and powerful kings, one crucial element is often overlooked. Where did the women fit into this world? Were they confined to the domestic sphere of the wagons, tasked only with raising children and managing the household? Or did the women of the steppe, like the men, also embody the wild and untamable spirit of their homeland? For centuries, we had only whispers and legends to guide us. But once again, it is the silent testimony of the earth, of the graves themselves, that has revealed a startling and revolutionary truth. For centuries, the ancient Greeks, a people who built their society on the rigid separation of the sexes, told a story that was to them both a fascinating fantasy and a terrifying nightmare. It was the legend of the Amazons, a mythical nation, composed entirely of warrior women. They were said to live on the furthest fringes of the known world. In the wild lands around the Black Sea, they were master horsewomen, fierce archers, and the sworn enemies of all men. To the Greeks, they were the ultimate symbol of a world turned upside down, a thrilling but unnatural inversion of civilized order. For over 2,000 years, this was all they were, a myth, a thrilling piece of folklore. But the Greeks were describing a real place, the edge of the great steppe, and it turns out they were not entirely inventing what they saw. Herodotus, the great historian, tells a story that attempts to bridge the gap between myth and reality. He writes that after a great battle, the Greeks captured a number of these Amazon warriors and set sail with them in their ships. The Amazons, true to their nature, rose up, slaughtered their male captors, and seized control of the vessels. But, having no knowledge of sailing, they were helpless, and their ships drifted at the mercy of the wind and waves until they washed ashore on the coast of Scythia here. The Amazons armed themselves and began to raid the Scythian herds. The Scythians, initially confused and assuming the raiders to be young men, fought back. It was only after a battle, when they were stripping the bodies of the dead, that they discovered the truth. Stunned by this revelation, the Scythian leaders made a new plan. They did not want to destroy these incredible women. They wanted to have children with them, to create a new generation of warriors who would possess the courage of both their mothers and their fathers. So they sent a group of their youngest men, not to fight, but to set up a camp near the Amazons, patiently waiting for an opportunity. In time, a kind of courtship began, a strange romance on the open steppe, and soon the two groups merged. The Scythian men were ready to bring their new wives back to their own people, but the Amazon women flatly refused. They declared that they could never live with the other Scythian women who spent their days in the wagons performing domestic chores. Their way of life, they said, was to ride, to hunt, and to go to war. And so they convinced their new husbands to take their inheritance, leave the main Scythian tribes, and journey eastward to found a new nation, the Sarmatians, a people where women fought alongside men as equals. For millennia, this story was treated as just that, a charming fable to explain the origins of a neighboring tribe. But then, modern archaeology provided a stunning epilogue. As scientists began to excavate thousands of Scythian kurgans with modern techniques, they noticed something strange. A surprising number of the graves that contained a full warrior's burial complete with bows, arrows, swords, and spears did not hold the skeletons of men. When the bones were analyzed, they were found to be female. This was not an isolated case. In some Scythian cemeteries, as many as 1 in 4 of all warrior tombs belonged to women. And these were not simply ceremonial burials honoring high-status women. The proof was written in their very bones. Skeletal analysis revealed lives of incredible hardship and violence. They had the telltale bowed legs and developed joints of a life spent on horseback. More shockingly, they bore the unmistakable scars of battle. Archaeologists found female skeletons with skulls fractured by battle axes, with bronze arrowheads still embedded in their vertebrae, with arms bearing the healed cuts of a sword parry. These were women who had lived and fought and died as warriors. They were discovered buried with the same honors as their male counterparts, equipped for the same eternal battles in the afterlife. The evidence was undeniable. Scythian society included a significant number of warrior women who rode and fought alongside their men. The Greek legend of the Amazons was not a complete invention after all. It was a mythologized, exaggerated reflection of a reality that the Greeks, with their rigid gender roles, could barely comprehend. There was no all-female nation, but the Scythian way of life, forged in the harsh freedom of the steppe, had created a society where women could achieve power and status as warriors. The truth behind the myth was, in its own way, even more remarkable than the legend itself. These remarkable graves, holding both men and women warriors, are more than just archaeological sites filled with gold and bones. They are sacred spaces, portals into the Scythian soul. They are the most profound and lasting expression of their beliefs about life, death, and the great journey that awaits beyond. To truly understand the Scythians, we must now leave the world of the living and enter the silent, frozen domain of the Kurgan. To travel across the vast, flat plains of Ukraine or southern Siberia today is to witness a landscape still haunted by its ancient masters. The horizon is not always a perfect, unbroken line. It is periodically interrupted by gentle, rounded hills that rise from the earth with a quiet and deliberate presence. These are not natural formations. They are the Kurgans. They are the eternal homes of the Scythian dead, the only permanent structures they ever built. In a world defined by constant motion, the only thing the Scythians created to last forever was a house for the afterlife. These mounds are the pyramids of the steppe. Some are modest bumps in the earth, marking the resting place of a common warrior. Others are colossal, man-made mountains of soil and stone, visible for miles, declaring the immense power of the king who lies sleeping at their heart. For the Scythians, these were more than just graves. They were anchors for their society, sacred monuments that tethered their ever-moving world to the land of their ancestors. They were territorial markers, visible proclamations of power, and, most importantly, they were portals, liminal spaces that connected the world of the living with the spirit world of the dead. To understand the Scythian soul, we must witness the rituals that created these monuments. And thanks to the incredible, detailed account of Herodotus, we can follow the solemn and brutal ceremony of a royal funeral, step by step. The story begins with the death of a king. This was not merely a political event, it was a cosmic disturbance. The sacred link between the people and the gods had been broken. As the news of the king's passing spread across the steppe, a profound and ritualized mourning began. The nation entered a state of sacred grief. The first task was the preparation of the king's body for its final journey. This was a sophisticated process of embalming, designed to preserve the monarch in a lifelike state. His abdomen would be cut open and the internal organs removed. The empty cavity was then cleansed with palm wine and filled with a mixture of fragrant, preserving spices, crushed frankincense, parsley seed, and anise. The incision was sewn shut, and the entire body was then meticulously coated in a protective layer of wax. The king was being made ready, transformed from a mortal man into an eternal effigy of himself. Once prepared, the king's body was placed upon a magnificent wagon, and then his last great journey began. For 40 days, this solemn procession would travel throughout the vast territories of all the Scythian tribes under his rule. It was a final tour of his kingdom, a chance for all of his subjects to pay their last respects. As the funeral wagon passed through each tribal land, a visceral and shocking ritual of communal grief would unfold. The common people were not passive observers. They were required to participate in the king's death. Every man would make a cut on his ear, shave his head in a circular pattern, lacerate his arms, slice his forehead and nose, and even pierce his left hand with an arrow. This was a shared, physical expression of loss, a bloodletting that mirrored the great wound opened in the fabric of their nation by the king's death. They were marking their own bodies as a sign of their devotion, temporarily disfiguring themselves to reflect the broken state of their world. Finally, after 40 days of this grim procession, the funeral cortege would arrive at its destination. This was a sacred and remote place, often a valley or plain already dotted with the ancestral kurgans of past kings. It was here, in this great necropolis, that the final and most terrible phase of the funeral would take place. Thousands of Scythians from across the empire would now gather. The air would be thick with the smoke of campfires, the lowing of countless cattle, and a somber, sacred silence. The king had completed his journey across the land of the living. He was now at the threshold of the underworld, and a great and bloody sacrifice was about to begin. The great funeral procession has come to a halt. The king's body, having completed its final tour of the lands he once ruled, now rests at the threshold of eternity. Before him lies a vast, open pit, the entrance to his new, subterranean kingdom. The air is heavy with the grief of a nation, and the stage is set for a dark and elaborate ritual of sacrifice, a final, terrible testament to the power he held in life, and the power he was expected to wield in death. Inside the great pit, burial chamber has been prepared. It is a house within the earth, its walls often lined with timber logs to form a kind of subterranean cabin, and its floor covered with a soft mattress of reeds and felt. The king's body, preserved in wax and spices, is brought down and laid gently upon a ceremonial bier. He is not being buried. He is being put to bed for his final, long sleep. Then, his eternal household is arranged around him. This is not a journey he will take alone. The Scythians believed the afterlife was a direct continuation of the mortal world, and a king must be equipped with everything he needs to maintain his status. His most precious personal belongings are placed beside him. His Achenex sword, its hilt gleaming with gold, is laid within reach. His goritos, the combination bow case and quiver, is filled with his finest arrows, their bronze tips sharpened for battles in the next world. Golden cups from which he will drink, bronze cauldrons filled with meat for his eternal feasts, and clay amphorae filled with Greek wine, a luxury imported from the south, are all carefully positioned within the chamber. He is provided for, but a king needs more than weapons and wine. A king needs servants, and it is now that the ritual takes its darkest turn. The Scythian belief was absolute. The king's personal retinue, his closest and most essential companions, were bound to serve him not just in life, but in death as well. One of his concubines, chosen to accompany him, is ritually strangled and laid to rest beside him. Then, his most vital attendants are brought to the edge of the grave, his cupbearer, his cook, his groom who tended his horses, his personal messenger, and his guards. They too are killed, and their bodies carefully arranged within the tomb. To us, it is an act of unimaginable cruelty. But in the Scythian worldview, this was likely considered a sacred duty, a final and ultimate act of loyalty that ensured their own honored place in the king's eternal court. The sacrifice then extends to the creatures that defined their civilization, the horses, dozens of the king's finest steeds, the ones he rode in life, are killed, their bodies placed in the great pits surrounding the central chamber, their ornate tack and saddles still upon them. They are the ghostly herd that will carry the king and his spectral court across the grasslands of the afterlife. When all the sacrifices are complete, the burial chamber is sealed. A roof of timber is laid across it, and the great work of filling the pit begins. Once it is level with the ground, the entire tribe, tens of thousands of people, participates in the final act. They begin to build the mound, the kurgan, using simple baskets and their bare hands. They move earth and stone, raising a great, artificial mountain over their fallen king. It is a monumental, collective effort, a final act of devotion that could take weeks to complete, creating a permanent landmark on the ever-changing face of the steppe. But the ritual is not yet over. Herodotus tells us of one final, chilling ceremony that took place on the one-year anniversary of the king's burial. 50 of the king's remaining retainers, the best young men from his household, were chosen, along with 50 of his finest remaining horses. The men and horses were all killed. The horses were then gutted and stuffed with straw and impaled on great stakes, driven into the ground, arranged in a perfect, silent circle around the base of the kurgan. Then, the bodies of the 50 dead retainers were propped upright onto the backs of the horses, as if riding them, a spectral, eternal honor guard, frozen in time, destined to watch over their master's tomb for all eternity, a terrifying and silent warning to any who would dare disturb his slumber. This immense investment of wealth, life, and labor reveals the very core of the Scythian soul. The afterlife was not a wispy, ethereal heaven, but a tangible, physical continuation of their mortal existence. Their tombs were not graves, they were palaces for the dead. This profound focus on the world beyond life also shaped their interactions with the living, particularly with the great, settled empires to their south, who viewed these rituals and the people who performed them with a mixture of awe, fascination, and absolute terror. The rituals of the kurgan, the immense and bloody sacrifices of servants and horses, reveal a people profoundly connected to a spiritual world invisible to outsiders. To the great settled civilizations of the south, these practices were the ultimate proof of a wild and savage nature. The Scythians existed on the very edge of their maps, a terrifying and fascinating people whose motives were as alien as the endless plains they called home. But they were not entirely isolated. Along the northern shores of the Black Sea, a frontier existed, a shoreline where two worlds, two completely different visions of humanity, met in a delicate and often tense dance of trade, curiosity, and conflict. It was here that the Scythian empire of motion collided with the world of stone and columns, the world of the ancient Greeks, beginning in the 7th century before Christ. Greek city-states, hungry for land and resources, began to send out colonists to the furthest reaches of the known world. They founded cities like Olbia, Chersonesos, and Pantikupium on the coast of what is now Ukraine and Crimea. Imagine the scene. A Greek citizen could stand in the agora of Olbia, a marketplace surrounded by stone temples built in the Doric order, speaking his own language and using his own currency. But if he were to walk to the edge of the city and look north, he would see no more cities, no more farms, no more roads. He would see only the silent, intimidating immensity of the steppe, the domain of the horse lords. These colonies were islands of Greek civilization in a vast Scythian sea. For centuries, these two worlds coexisted in a state of wary but profitable symbiosis. They needed each other. The burgeoning cities of mainland Greece, especially Athens, were dependent on a steady supply of grain to feed their growing populations, and the fertile black earth cultivated by the agricultural Scythians provided it in abundance. Beyond grain, the Greeks craved the fabled gold of the steppe, as well as furs, honey, and a constant supply of slaves to work their mines and farms. In return, the Scythian nobility developed an insatiable taste for the luxuries of the Mediterranean. Chief among these was Greek wine, stronger and more refined than their native kumis. Wine was imported in massive clay jars called amphorae, thousands of which have been found in the ruins of Scythian settlements and in the solemn darkness of their kurgans. They also prized the masterful craftsmanship of the Greeks. Exquisite painted pottery, both red figure and black figure, depicting scenes from Greek mythology, was a high-status item used in their feasts. Ornate bronze mirrors, fine jewelry, and elegant metal vases were all eagerly traded for. This intense interaction gave birth to a unique and breathtaking fusion of artistic styles, known today as Greco-Scythian art. This was not simply Greek art sold to Scythians. This was art commissioned by wealthy Scythian patrons from master Greek artisans who adapted their classical skills to depict the world of the steppe. The result is some of the most beautiful and evocative metalwork ever created. Consider the magnificent solid gold pectoral or chest piece discovered in the Tofster Mohila kurgan. It is a wide, crescent-shaped collar of almost impossible detail. The upper register shows scenes of Scythian daily life, rendered with a calm, classical realism. Two bare-chested men are carefully mending a shirt. Elsewhere, a Scythian milks a way, while another man makes kupmis. It is a peaceful, pastoral world. But the lower register is a scene of pure, savage violence, the brutal reality of the natural world that underpinned their existence. Griffins sink their claws into the necks of horses. A lion and a leopard bring down a stag, and hounds chase a hare. It is a masterpiece that captures the complete duality of the Scythian soul, the serene domesticity of the camp and the merciless violence of the wild dot, or consider the golden comb from the Solika kurgan. At its top is a stunningly realistic sculpture of a battle in progress. A Scythian nobleman on a rearing horse, clad in full armor, drives his spear into a fallen enemy. Another warrior on foot rushes to his aid. The anatomy of the men and horses, the tension in their muscles, the detail of their armor, is pure Greek craftsmanship at its finest. But the subjects, their clothing, their weapons, their fierce and bearded faces are unmistakably Scythian. It is a perfect marriage of two cultures, a Greek hand telling a Scythian story. Our guide to this complex relationship is the historian Herodotus. He traveled to the Black Sea colony of Olbia and dedicated much of his great work, the Histories, to describing the customs of the Scythians. To him and to the Greeks, they were the ultimate barbarians. They wore trousers instead of tunics. They drank their wine undiluted, a shocking practice to the Greeks, and they had no cities or temples. Yet, alongside this view of them as savages, there was also a deep and abiding sense of admiration. The Greeks saw in the Scythians a kind of noble purity, a fierce independence and a disdain for the soft luxuries that, they felt, were corrupting their own civilization. They were a people who could not be tamed. This complex relationship of trade, art, and wary respect defined the Scythian encounter with the Greek world. But another great empire, one that lay to the south, would not approach them with the curiosity of a merchant or a historian. They would come with the sword and the spear, with the intention of conquest. The Persian Empire, the greatest superpower of its age, was about to turn its gaze northward and attempt to swallow the great, unconquerable steppe. The world of the ancient Greeks met the Scythians with a mixture of commerce and curiosity. But to the south of the great steppe lay another power, an empire of a completely different scale and ambition. This was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and it was, without exaggeration, the greatest superpower the world had ever known. Its domains stretched from the plains of India in the east to the shores of Egypt and Libya in the west. It was a sophisticated, multicultural empire of vast cities, intricate road networks, and a seemingly invincible army, and its ruler was Darius the Great, the King of Kings. A brilliant organizer and a conqueror accustomed to absolute victory. In the year 513 before Christ, Darius turned his gaze northward. His motives remain a subject of debate. Perhaps it was revenge for Scythian raids that had troubled the southern kingdoms a century earlier. Perhaps it was a strategic move to secure the northern frontier of his empire before turning his attention toward Greece. Or perhaps it was simply hubris. Perhaps the King of Kings could not tolerate the existence of a free, unconquered people on his very doorstep. Whatever the reason, he amassed a colossal invasion force. The historian Herodotus speaks of 700,000 men, a number likely exaggerated, but there is no doubt it was one of the largest armies of antiquity. The invasion began with a monumental feat of engineering. The Persian army crossed the Bosphorus Strait from Asia into Europe on a great bridge of boats. They then marched north through Thrace and arrived at the banks of the mighty Danube River, the traditional border between the settled world and the great wilderness of the steppe. Here again, Darius commanded his engineers to construct a massive floating bridge, and the endless column of soldiers, cavalry, and supply wagons marched into Scythia. The greatest empire on earth had come to tame the wild grasslands. News of the approaching invasion spread like fire across the plains. The Scythian kings and chieftains gathered in a great council. They knew they could not hope to match the sheer numbers of the Persian army in a single, pitched battle. To do so would be suicide. But they had a greater weapon on their side, their homeland itself. They made a unanimous decision. They would not fight the war Darius wanted. They would fight the war the steppe demanded. Their grand strategy was brutally effective. As the Persian army advanced, the Scythians would simply retreat, staying always one step ahead. A portion of their army was tasked with escorting the great convoy of wagons, carrying all the women, children, and livestock on a long, looping path to the north, keeping them safely out of the Persians' reach. The main body of Scythian warriors, meanwhile, would act as a spectral screen in front of the advancing invaders. They systematically destroyed the land before the Persians, choking wells with earth and setting the vast grasslands on fire, denying the enemy both water for their men and fodder for their horses. They were a ghost army, shadowing the Persians, launching lightning raids on foraging parties. but melting away into the horizon whenever the main Persian force tried to engage them. What followed was one of the most frustrating military campaigns in history. Darius, the master conqueror, found himself marching deeper and deeper into an infinite and hostile void. He was conquering nothing. There were no cities to capture, no farms to seize, no population to subjugate. His massive army, a machine designed for decisive battles, was being slowly bled dry by exhaustion, starvation, and the maddening, unending emptiness of the plains. After weeks of this fruitless chase, an exasperated Darius sent a message to the Scythian king, "You strange man," the message began, "why do you keep running? If you believe you are strong enough to resist me, then stand your ground and fight. If you know you are the weaker, then stop your wandering and show your submission by bringing me gifts of earth and water." The reply from the Scythian king would become legendary. "This is our way of life." Idanthus is sent back. "We have no cities and no cultivated lands to worry about you destroying, so we have no reason to rush into a battle. However, we do have the tombs of our ancestors. If you can find these sacred graves and dare to desecrate them, then you will discover how we Scythians can fight. Until then, as for a master, I recognize only my ancestor, the god Papaya. And as for gifts, I am sending you the only ones you deserve." Shortly thereafter, a Scythian herald entered the Persian camp. He carried no message, only a collection of strange objects, which he laid before Darius and then departed. The gifts were a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. At first, Darius interpreted them with the arrogance of a king. The mouse lives in the earth, the frog in the water. The Scythians, he reasoned, were surrendering their land and their seas. The bird represented their swift horses, which they were also surrendering, and the arrows symbolized the surrender of their military power. But one of his wiser advisors offered the true, terrifying interpretation. "Unless you Persians can become birds and fly up into the sky," he explained, "or mice and burrow deep into the earth, or frogs and escape into the swamps, you will never get away from this land. You are doomed to be struck down by our arrows." It was not a message of submission, it was a death sentence. The final humiliation came soon after. The Scythian army finally formed up as if for battle, and the weary Persians, eager for a decisive end, prepared their lines. But as the two armies faced each other, a single hair darted out from between the ranks. At the sight of it, the entire Scythian line broke into a chaotic and joyful chase, their shouts and laughter echoing across the plain. They had completely forgotten the Persian army, more interested in the hunt. This ultimate act of contempt was the final straw. Darius realized he was not even considered a worthy opponent. That night, leaving their sick and wounded behind to be massacred, the great Persian army began its long, desperate, and humiliating retreat back to the Danube, harassed by the ghosts of the steppe every step of the way. The greatest empire on earth had been defeated not by an army, but by a landscape, and by a people who were its perfect, unconquerable extension. The victory over the Persian Empire was more than a military triumph. It was a spiritual affirmation. The Scythians had proven that their world, their way of life, was protected by a power greater than that of the King of Kings. But what was this power? Who were the gods that a Scythian warrior thanked after a battle? What did they see when they looked up at the endless star-filled night sky of the steppe? To understand the Scythian soul, we must try to understand their faith. A religion as vast, as open, and as untamed as their homeland. Like their empire, The Scythian faith had no walls. In an age when other great civilizations were building magnificent stone temples to house their gods, the Scythians built none. To them, the divine was not something to be confined within a building. The divine was the sky itself, the earth beneath. Their feet, the fire that warmed their hearth, and the wind that whispered across the grass. Their temple was the entire world, and their worship was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Our guide into this spiritual landscape is once again the historian Herodotus, who listened to their stories and tried to understand their pantheon by comparing it to the gods of his own Greek world. At the very center of their faith, held in the highest reverence, was the goddess Tabete. The Greeks equated her with their own Hestia, the goddess of the hearth. But Tabete was something more ancient, more primordial. She was the goddess of the foundational fire, the sacred flame that was the spiritual heart of every family, every clan, and the kingdom itself. The king's royal hearth was the most sacred altar in the entire nation, and an oath sworn by it was the most solemn and unbreakable bond in their society. To break such an oath was to invite not just personal dishonor, but a cosmic imbalance that could bring ruin to the entire tribe. From this central fire, the rest of the pantheon radiated outwards. There was Papaios, the sky father, whom the Greeks saw as their Zeus. He was the great male principal, the thunderer who ruled the heavens. His consort was Api, the earth mother, a goddess born of the soil itself, the great female principle from whom all life sprang. Together, Papaios and Api were the cosmic parents of the Scythian people, a classic pairing found in the beliefs of many ancient cultures who lived in close communion with nature. Beyond these were other powerful deities who governed the forces. Of their world, there was Goitos, the sun god, equated with the Greek Apollo. There was Argimpasa, a powerful goddess of fertility and sovereignty, whom the Greeks compared to their own Aphrodite. And there was Thagimasardus, whom Herodotus likens to Poseidon. Curiously, Thagimasardus was not a god of the sea, which had little importance to the Scythians, but was the special patron deity of the royal Scythians alone, a protector of the kingly line. All these gods were worshipped, but they were not represented. There were no statues of Tabete, no idols of Papaios. Their presence was felt, not seen. However, there was one terrifying exception. Among all the gods of the Scythian pantheon, only one was granted a physical form and a dedicated altar. This was their god of war, a deity so fierce that Herodotus could only compare him to his own brutal Ares. And the worship of this god was the most public and most violent ritual in their spiritual lives. In each region of the Scythian kingdom, a great altar to this war god would be erected. It was not a structure of stone, but a massive, square platform, hundreds of yards on each side, built from immense piles of brushwood and sticks, packed down year after year. Upon the flat top of this colossal monument, a single object was planted, upright, pointing to the sky. This was the idol of the god. It was not a sculpted human form. It was a simple, ancient iron short sword, an axe. To the Scythians, the sword did not merely represent the god of war. The sword was the god. Here, once every year, a great and bloody sacrifice was made. The tribe would bring offerings of cattle and horses, but the god demanded a darker tribute. For every 100 prisoners of war the tribe had captured, one man was chosen to be sacrificed. The ritual was performed with a cold and solemn precision. Wine was poured over the chosen victim's head. He was then led to a vessel where his throat was cut. The sacred blood was carefully collected, and a chieftain would carry it to the very top of the brushwood altar and pour it directly over the blade of the iron sword, feeding the god with the lifeblood of a conquered enemy. But the ritual did not end there. The dead victim's right arm, from the shoulder down, was hacked off. With a great heave, the chieftain would then throw the severed limb high into the air. Where it landed, there it lay. The rest of the body was left at the base of the altar. This public and violent worship of a god of war reveals one face of the Scythian soul, the face of the ruthless warrior. But their spiritual world also had a quieter, far more mysterious side, a world of whispers and visions, guided by enigmatic figures who walked the strange and shimmering line between the worlds of the living and the dead. The brutal, public worship of their war god reveals one face of the Scythian soul. But their faith also had a more personal, mystical, and often hidden dimension. This was a world of whispers and visions, of fortunes told and futures foreseen. A world guided by enigmatic figures who walked a strange and shimmering line between the domains of the living and the dead. These were the Scythian diviners, the keepers of secrets. Divination was a deadly serious business. It was most often employed when the king himself fell ill. The Scythians believed the king's health was tied to the sanctity of the oaths sworn by his royal hearth. An illness was therefore proof that someone in the kingdom had broken this most sacred vow. The king would immediately summon his most trusted diviners, who were tasked with identifying the transgressor. The most common method of divination was a slow and deliberate ritual involving bundles of willow wands. A diviner would arrive carrying a great number of these sticks. He would lay them carefully upon the ground, and then, with intense concentration, he would begin to separate them, laying them out one by one, all the while pronouncing his prophecy. Once all the wands were laid out, he would gather them up again and repeat the entire process. It was through this methodical, repetitive act that a vision of the truth was believed to emerge from the chaos of possibility. But there was another, more powerful and more feared class of diviners known as the Eurasia. These were not ordinary men. Herodotus describes them as a hereditary class of shamans who were unmanly or androgynous. They wore women's clothing, performed women's work, and spoke with a high-pitched, feminine voice. Their very existence was believed to be the result of a divine curse. The legend told that their ancestors had once plundered a temple of the goddess Archaeological, and in her fury, the goddess had inflicted upon them and all their descendants a womanish disease. These Eurasia commanded immense respect and terror. In equal measure, they practiced a unique form of divination, using the inner bark of the linden tree. An Eurasia would take a piece of this bark and split it into 3 thin strips. As he pronounced his prophecy, he would continuously plait and unplait these strips between his fingers, a constant weaving motion from which the threads of fate would be read. To be named a perjurer by the common Willowand diviners was dangerous enough, but to be accused by an Eurasia was a virtual death sentence, for their connection to the spirit world was believed to be absolute. This deep connection to a world of spirits and symbols was not limited to the shamans. It was etched into the very skin of the Scythian people. For centuries, the intricate tattoos described by ancient writers were just another piece of folklore. But in the high Altai mountains of Siberia, the permanently frozen ground created a miracle of preservation. In tombs like those at Pizeric, archaeologists discovered the mummified bodies of Scythian nobles, their skin still intact after 100 years, and on that skin was a breathtaking panorama of art. These were not crude markings. They were masterpieces of swirling dynamic imagery, covering the arms, legs, and torsos of both men and women. Fantastical creatures, a menagerie of spirit animals, were depicted in fierce and graceful combat. A monstrous griffin sinks its beak into the neck of a stag. Coiled panthers, ready to spring, adorn a warrior's shoulders. Mythical fish twist their way down a forearm. This was the animal style, the same art found on their golden treasures, but here it was made a permanent part of the body. This was spiritual armor. Each tattoo was likely a powerful talisman, a way to channel the strength of a spirit animal, to mark social status, or to protect the wearer from evil forces. They were a sacred text written on human skin, a story that each person would carry with them throughout their life and into the next. The Scythian spiritual life concluded with one final, remarkable ritual, an act of purification after the grim business of a funeral. Once a burial was complete, those who participated in it were considered spiritually unclean and needed to be cleansed. To do this, they would construct small tents made from 3 poles leaning together and covered with a thick, tightly sealed layer of wool felt. Inside this tiny enclosure, a dish filled with red-hot stones would be placed. The Scythians would then crawl inside, sealing the tent behind them. From a small bag, they would take the seeds of the hemp plant, what we now call cannabis, and throw them onto the hot stones. Herodotus, a Greek who had never witnessed anything like it, wrote that the seeds immediately began to smoke, creating a vapor thicker than any steam bath in Greece. The effect on the Scythians was profound. Delighted, Herodotus wrote, they howl with pleasure. This was not a party or a simple act of recreation. It was a ritual of spiritual cleansing, a vapor bath for the soul. It was a way to purify themselves from the contamination of death. And perhaps, in that thick, intoxicating smoke, to come one step closer to the world of the spirits they so revered. This intricate world of gods, shamans, and sacred smoke sustained them for centuries, but even the strongest spiritual armor cannot protect a people from the relentless march of time. A long, slow twilight was gathering on the endless horizon of the steppe. The world of the Scythians, this intricate tapestry of gods, spirits, and rituals, had sustained them for nearly 1,000 years. Their mastery of the horse and bow, their unbreakable bond with the vastness of the steppe, had made them seem like an eternal, elemental force. But no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to the relentless march of time. Even for the Scythians, a long, slow twilight was gathering on the endless horizon. Their end did not come in a single, glorious battle, a dramatic fall from grace. It was a gradual fading, a slow erosion caused by forces both within their society and beyond it. Ironically, the first cracks in their foundation appeared not from weakness, but from their greatest success. The immense wealth that flowed into their world from the Greek grain trade began to subtly poison the very roots of their nomadic identity. The royal Scythians and the tribal chieftains who controlled this trade accumulated a fortune in gold and luxury goods that was previously unimaginable. With this wealth came a desire for a more comfortable, settled existence. Along the great rivers, like the Dnieper, large, fortified settlements began to appear. These were not true cities in the Greek sense, but sprawling centers of power where the nobility could store their wealth, manage their trade, and live a life of greater ease. The kings and their retinues, once constantly on the move with their people, now spent more and more time in these opulent proto-cities. They began to distance themselves from the harsh, egalitarian realities of the open steppe. The universal warrior ethos, where every man was a self-sufficient herder and soldier, began to fray. Society became more stratified, with a vast gulf opening between the fabulously wealthy, semi-sedentary rulers and the common nomadic herders who still followed the ancient cycles. They were slowly trading their greatest strength, their limitless mobility, for the gilded cage of material wealth. At the same time, the steppe itself, their great provider, may have begun to betray them. Climate data from that period suggests a significant shift occurred. The climate of Eurasia became drier. This would have had a catastrophic effect on a people whose entire existence depended on grass. A subtle decrease in annual rainfall year after year would mean less abundant pastures. The herds would weaken. Overgrazing would become a serious problem, turning once lush grasslands into semi-desert. This environmental pressure would have created immense internal stress, leading to conflict between tribes over scarce resources and fundamentally weakening the economic foundation of their entire world. As the Scythians were being weakened from within, a new, formidable shadow was rising in the east. They were the Sauromations, and later the Sarmatians, a collection of nomadic tribes closely related to the Scythians by language and ancestry. The Greeks, in fact, believed them to be the descendants of the mythical union of Scythian men and Amazon women, and in a way, their society seemed to reflect this legend. As their women enjoyed a remarkably high status and were known to ride and fight alongside their men. For centuries, they had lived on the eastern fringes of the Scythian world, but now they began to move west. The Sarmatians were not simply a copy of the Scythians. They were the next evolution of steppe warfare. While they also employed the horse archer, they had developed a new and terrifying military doctrine centered on heavy cavalry. These were the first true lancers of the plains. They bred larger, stronger horses, capable of carrying an armored rider. They perfected the use of the contos, a long, heavy, two-handed lance designed for shock tactics, a weapon that could shatter a line of infantry and skewer an enemy rider. This new warrior was the cataphract, a living juggernaut of man and beast. Both rider and horse were often encased in a protective layer of overlapping scale armor, made of bronze or iron. With the development of more advanced saddles that gave them a more stable seat, these Sarmatian lancers could deliver a devastating, disciplined charge that the more lightly equipped Scythian horse archers struggled to counter. They were a new storm gathering on the horizon. The arrival of the Sarmatians was not a single, unified invasion. It was a slow, relentless demographic wave that washed over the steppe for 200 years, from the 4th to the 2nd century before Christ. They were not just conquering the Scythians, they were displacing them. Tribe by tribe, clan by clan, the Sarmatians pushed westward, seizing the best grazing lands, disrupting the ancient migration routes, and challenging the Scythians for control of the Great Plains. The masters of the steppe, weakened by internal changes and a changing climate, now found themselves facing a rival who had taken their own way of life and perfected it into something new, something stronger. The long twilight had begun, and a new, hungrier people were rising to claim the dawn. Pressed from within by a changing world and from without by the relentless advance of the Sarmatians, the Scythian tribes found themselves in an impossible position. Their way of life, once a source of invincible strength, was now becoming untenable. The great open steppe, the spiritual heartland that had nurtured them for a millennium, was no longer theirs. One by one, the tribes were defeated, absorbed, or pushed ever westward, ceding the vast grasslands to the new masters, the Lancers, the Scythians, the quintessential people of the open range, were forced to retreat. Their final refuge was the Crimean Peninsula, a beautiful and fertile land of coastal plains and low mountains, jutting out into the Black Sea. Here, in this much smaller, more contained territory, the remnants of the once mighty Scythian nation gathered for their last stand. And it was here that they underwent the ultimate, tragic transformation. The great nomads, the people who had defeated the Persian king because they had no walls to defend, were now forced to build walls of their own. In the 2nd century before Christ, they founded a final kingdom, often known to history as Scythia Minor, and this kingdom had a true capital city, a permanent settlement of stone called Neapolis Sithica, the Scythian New City. Its ruins can still be seen today on the outskirts of the modern city of Simferopol. This was the final, ironic chapter of their story. The lords of the moving palace now lived in houses of stone. The people whose border was the horizon now sheltered behind thick, defensive walls. The city they built was a hybrid of their old and new worlds, a blend of Scythian and Greek architectural styles, with a royal palace, public buildings, and grand stone mausoleums for their last kings. For a few centuries, this Crimean kingdom endured. They were a shadow of their former selves, but still a formidable local power. They abandoned the last vestiges of their nomadic life, becoming a settled people who ruled over the agricultural populations of the peninsula. They cast a covetous eye on the still wealthy Greek coastal cities, like Chersonesos, and much of their final history is a series of brutal wars as they attempted to dominate their old trading partners and seize control of the Crimean ports. They were no longer the carefree masters of an endless domain. They were a cornered power, fighting for survival in a world that was rapidly changing around them. The end did not come from a single enemy, but from all directions. The world was entering a new, chaotic era of mass migrations. In the 3rd century, after Christ, a new and devastating force swept down from the north. The Goths, these fierce Germanic tribes, poured into the Black Sea region, bringing fire and destruction to all who stood in their way. The last Scythian kingdom, already weakened by centuries of conflict, could not withstand this final onslaught. The great walls of Neapolis Sithica were breached, and the city was sacked and burned. This catastrophic event marked the end of the Scythians as a distinct political and cultural entity. Their last king was slain. Their last capital was a smoldering ruin. But what does it mean for a people to disappear? They were not all killed in a single, final battle. Their end was a slow fading, an assimilation into the great, turbulent melting pot of what historians call the migration period. With their kingdom shattered and their leadership gone, the surviving Scythian people became a scattered and broken remnant. They were absorbed by the very peoples who had replaced and conquered them. Their bloodline merged with that of the Sarmatians, the Goths, the Alans, and later the Huns and the Slavs, who would come to dominate the region. Their ancient Iranian language, once spoken across the entire steppe, slowly fell silent, replaced by Gothic and later by Turkic and Slavic tongues. Their unique customs, their art, their entire way of life, dissolved into the cultures of their conquerors, leaving only faint traces behind. The empire of the wind had finally dissipated into the air. The masters of motion were rendered static, and then they were gone. By the early Middle Ages, their very name had become a memory, a classical term used by Byzantine scholars to describe all the various barbarians of the north, a testament to the terrifying legacy they had once forged. The people themselves had vanished from the stage of history, And so, their long twilight ended in the darkness of a forgotten past. Their language is silent, their kingdom is dust. But did they truly disappear without a trace? Or does the legacy of such a powerful and unique people live on in more subtle ways? In our final chapter, we will search for the immortal echoes of the Scythians, the faint whispers of their name and their spirit that still resonate in the world today. And so, the Scythians, as a distinct people, vanished from the stage of history. Their language fell silent, their last kingdom turned to dust, and their name became a memory. But does a civilization truly disappear when its last city falls? Or does its legacy ripple outwards through time, in ways both visible and invisible? A people who wrote no books and built no libraries cannot leave a history in their own words. The Scythians, however, left a different kind of testament. To find their immortal echoes, we must learn to read the landscape they shaped, the treasures they buried, and the revolutionary way of war that they perfected. Their first and most visible legacy is written upon the face of the earth itself. From the plains of Hungary to the mountains of Mongolia, tens of thousands of kurgans still punctuate the landscape. They stand in silent, patient rows, the last sentinels of a lost empire. For centuries, they were regarded as simple hills, features of the natural world, but we now know they are a vast open-air library, with each mound a chapter in the story of a forgotten king or a noble warrior. They are the most profound physical mark the Scythians left upon the world, a testament to a people who, in a life of constant motion, chose to make their homes for the dead the only permanent thing they ever built. But it is what lies inside these earthen monuments that speaks to us with the most eloquence. The second and most breathtaking legacy of the Scythians is their art, their language of gold. Imagine the moment of discovery. An archaeologist, after weeks of careful excavation, finally breaks through the timber roof of a burial chamber that has been sealed for 2,500 years. A light is shown into the darkness, and the beam is answered by 1,000 points of gleaming yellow fire. This is the voice of the Scythians. The treasures they took with them to the afterlife are our most direct connection to their world. Their minds and their souls. Great museums, most notably the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, now act as guardians of this legacy. Here you can stand before the very objects we have spoken of on our journey. You can see the golden pectoral from Tofsta Mohila, with its scenes of serene daily life unfolding just above a maelstrom of animal violence. You can gaze upon the golden comb from Salaka, a perfect moment of furious combat, captured with the impossible skill of a Greek master working for a Scythian lord. This art is their history, a history told not in letters, but in the graceful lines of a stag, the coiled tension of a panther, and the fierce gaze of a bearded warrior. And in the frozen tombs of the Altai Mountains, at sites like Pazyryk, the legacy becomes even more intimate. Here, the permafrost preserved not just gold, but organic materials. We have found their ornate felt and wool carpets, the oldest in the world, their patterns still vibrant. We have found their clothing, their wooden shields, and the very logs of their burial chambers. And most remarkably, we have found them, the bodies of their nobles, mummified by the ice, their skin still bearing the intricate dark blue tattoos of spirit animals that were their sacred armor. This is not just history. It is a human connection, a chance to come face to face with the people themselves across a gulf of millennia. Yet, perhaps their most influential legacy was not something they buried, but something they unleashed upon. The world, the third great echo of the Scythians, is their revolutionary art of war. Their perfection of mobile ranged combat, centered on the horse archer, fundamentally changed the course of military history. They created the blueprint for steppe warfare, a devastatingly effective system that would be copied, adapted, and perfected by countless nomadic peoples for the next 1500 years. The chain of influence is direct and undeniable. The Sarmatians who replaced them adopted their model and added the new terror of the heavy lancer, creating a combined arms system of archers and shock cavalry. The Huns, who later stormed into Europe, brought with them a similar style of terrifying, fluid horse archery that baffled the Roman legions. And 1,000 years after the Scythians had faded, the greatest of all nomadic conquerors, the Mongols, would use an evolved but fundamentally similar strategy to carve out the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, the thundering hordes of Genghis Khan, with their swarms of horse archers and their mastery of the feigned retreat, were the distant military heirs of the Scythians. The tactics that had humiliated the great Persian army on the Ukrainian plains were echoed a millennium later on the fields of Poland and the plains of Persia. The Scythians taught the world a new way to fight, and the world would never be the same. The legacy of the Scythians, written in the earth of their kurgans and in the bloody evolution of warfare, is a powerful one. But their most remarkable echoes are also their most subtle. They are the ghostly traces of language, blood, and myth that survive to this day, hidden in the remote corners of the world and deep within the fabric of our own modern imagination. To find these last traces, we must listen very carefully. The fourth great legacy of the Scythians is a living voice. High in the Caucasus Mountains, straddling the border between Russia and Georgia, live a people known as the Scythians. For centuries, they have fiercely maintained their unique culture and language in their mountain strongholds. And their language is a living fossil. The Ossetian tongue is a direct, modern descendant of the language spoken by the Alans, who were a branch of the Sarmatians, who themselves spoke a later form of the same language family as the Scythians. It is the sole survivor of the entire Scytho-Sarmatian branch of the Iranian language family. To hear the cadence of a Scythian speech, to listen to their ancient epics of heroic warriors called the Narts, is the closest we will ever come to hearing. The language that was once spoken from the Danube to the Altai. It is a single, surviving whisper from a world that has otherwise fallen silent. The fifth legacy is one that is carried unseen within millions of people today. While the Scythian culture was absorbed and their language replaced, their genetic code was not erased. Their bloodline flowed onward, merging with the countless other peoples who crossed the Great Steppe. Modern genetic studies have revealed a significant Scythian ancestral component in many modern populations, particularly among peoples of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Their ghostly signature lives on, a secret inheritance carried in the veins of people who may have never heard the name of their distant, horse-riding ancestors. And finally, there is the legacy they left in our minds, in the stories we tell. They were one of the first and most powerful examples of the noble savage in the Western imagination. To the Greeks, they were the ultimate barbarians, a terrifying mirror image to their own ordered, city-based life. But they were also a source of fascination, a symbol of a wild and untamable freedom that the Greeks secretly admired. And through the very real evidence of their powerful warrior women, the Scythians gave the world the raw material for one of its most enduring legends, the myth of the Amazons, a story that continues to captivate us to this day. And so, our long journey with this phantom empire comes to an end. We have followed them from their mysterious origins in the heart of Asia We have ridden with them across their ocean of grass. We have witnessed the terrifying effectiveness of their art of war, and we have stood in silent awe before the golden treasures of their eternal tombs. They leave us with a profound question. What is the true measure of a civilization's greatness? Is it found only in the height of the stone monuments it leaves behind, or the number of books in its libraries? The Scythians offer us a different answer. Theirs was the greatness of perfect adaptation, a culture that achieved a flawless and sustainable harmony with its demanding environment. Theirs was the greatness of freedom, a society that valued the boundless horizon more than any wall, and mobility more than any monument. They prove that a civilization can be profoundly sophisticated, artistically brilliant, and historically significant without ever building a single permanent city. They were born of the steppe. They became the human embodiment of the steppe, and in the end, they simply melted back into it. If you stand today on the plains of Ukraine, amidst the silent sleeping kurgans, and you feel the wind rush past you, listen closely. You may just hear the faint, ghostly echo of 1,000 thundering hooves, a final whisper from the immortal lords of the endless plains. The story is over, but their echoes remain. Now, let the silence of the steppe soothe your mind. Close your eyes and rest. Good night from the bedtime historian.